this might sound weird, but Greed Island is both the worst and the best arc so far. And by that, I mean I had more fun in the first half of this arc than I did pretty much with any of the others, and it had a brilliant balance of emotion, action, and narrative, creating a wonderful cacophony that rang beautifully in my ears. However, on the other hand, yeah, this arc has some of what I thought were the lowest points in the series in terms of entertainment value, but it also ended up having some of my favorite stuff out of the series, period. So what are we waiting for? Let's jump into this video game that turned out to be way more scary than I thought it would, and way more thought out than I could have ever anticipated. I'm Toy Not Mark, and this is my blind review for the clunky, the exciting, and intensely interesting Greed Island. But first, some housekeeping for York New City. Last week I said Hunter x Hunter from 1999 was over, and the comments proceeded to yell at me about how Greed Island is covered in the OVAs. Look, I know they exist, but it's not really the same series. The original 99 series and the final York New OVA were both directed by the legendary Kazuhiro Furuhashi, best known for Rurouni Kenshin. He has such a distinct style and a huge number of industry contacts that helped elevate that series into something special. However, with the Greed Island OVAs, Furuhashi is gone, instead replaced by Yukihiro Matsushita and Makoto Sato for parts 1 and 2 respectively. While the former did an okay job, the latter was pretty atrocious, and overall the OVAs are pretty poor, and I don't think they're worth talking about beyond maybe the... Ultimately, the point is that the staff and overall approach to the series in both tone and animation quality is so vastly different that a lot of people today just don't even consider it part of the original series. Additionally, on the review front, as I closed out my last video, a few of you might have felt as though the video ended abruptly, and you know, I can see why. And I think personally, from a creative point of view, my writing of that ending mostly spawned from it feeling sort of abrupt to me too. I really admired York New's dedication to the Mafia-style story, and I loved the interactions and choices made throughout. In some ways, I really liked that the arc ended with Kurapika employing strategy in order to avoid conflict, and overall, the arc subverted many expectations in that respect. However, I do think that the arc didn't feel like it had a definitive ending, and honestly, I'm okay with that. This story feels like everything bleeds so readily and easily into the next that finding the dividing lines between different arcs, particularly at the end of York New, felt difficult. And I think that's partially why I decided to make Paku's sacrifice the big climactic moment to end that particular video on. It just felt right to me. Okay, with that now out of the way, let's get into Greed Island. I think one of the strongest aspects of Greed Island is also one of its biggest weaknesses. Ironic as it may sound, but I think it's true. This arc takes itself quite seriously, and as such, regarding exposition, it can get quite heavy sometimes a little down the road, but I'll touch on that a little more later. This story does take itself very seriously, and you know what? I think it should. I mean, it's dealing with some truly mature subject matter with Gon and the others, and as a result, tons of focus is given to the structure of the story as well as the game itself. Without delay, the arc starts, and under no circumstances are we left hanging wondering what the Spider Troop or Phantom Troop, whatever you want to call them, will do next. The troop themselves explicitly tell them that they aren't after them right now due to the curse placed on Chrollo. It's a simple decision to make, but it made the story that much more digestible and enabled me to give Gon's portion of the story my full attention. And speaking of, finally, we get the auction that we've all been waiting for what feels like a century. And once the game Greed Island became the topic of the scene, I was delighted. I'm supremely invested in how Gon's search for his father will proceed, and I can't wait to see what lengths this game will push them to. I also like how Gon in almost every scene proves how perceptive he actually is. Despite him looking and acting like a naive kid 9 times out of 10, he's always got his head screwed on tight, picking up on little pieces of information like, I don't know, for instance, Jing not being the seller. It's not important now, but similar to when we were on the tower during the Hunter exams, Gon remembers elements that he can reapply to a later greater problem. In other words, I love the consistent character writing Togashi continues to produce for him and his other characters. There are indeed small moments like him accidentally raising his hand and bidding exorbitant amounts of money on the game, but those instances are born out of innocence, not a lack of intelligence, and I think that's an important distinction to make. When Gon understands what he needs to do, he always seems to find a way out of it in extremely creative and clever ways. And that comes to light in the opening chapters of this very section. Take, for example, his plan to not actually buy the game, but to instead keep tabs on who buys it so that he can play alongside the winning bidder. After all, they don't need the game, just the data, and it's a great observation and one that makes their likelihood of success reaching their goal that much more realistic. And that's not all. When the gentleman declines the offer for them to play, citing that they currently are looking for experienced hunters to participate, Gon remembers that the game can have unlimited players. These are small, easily missed instances, but you best believe very few people have this level of applied logic at the drop of a hat under pressure, which honestly helped to make Gon a very endearing character as I was reading. Killua might be number one in the popularity polls in Japan, but good God almighty, I love Gon. Also, I'm not sure how noteworthy or important this will become later down the line, but I'm a little interested in what's happening in the background of this story concerning Killua's brother. At every single auction, he seems to be bested when trying to bid for Greed Island. Looking back now, this could just be Togashi's vehicle for him to establish this exceptionally affluent individual who ends up buying up all the copies of the game, but it seems strange to me to use a named character to achieve this when you could just as easily make up a random person for that very instance. It might be nothing, but I thought it worth mentioning in case it goes somewhere down the line. But anyway, as the boys train to nab a spot among those playing the game of Greed Island, the means with which they strive to refine or hone their abilities borders on the path illogical. Oh, and after receiving some insight from Kurapika, I learned that he held chains, slept with chains, looked at chains, and sketched chains like one of his French girls for an ungodly amount of time, which suggests that Kurapika didn't just conjure a shovel like I thought he did for the purposes of bearing Uvo, but instead he brought one in advance. Let that sink in. It's really cool getting to see the confident and determined Killua refine and discover a special ability, but Gon's struggle once again seems to be the most interesting to me. There's a particular focus on behalf of Togashi to show us that Gon is amazing time and again throughout the series, only for him to undercut himself time and again when he's alone. He doesn't believe in himself, with all of these instances together acting as subtle reminders that he's struggling with self-esteem deep down. And really, all of these occurrences dotted throughout this story have to, in some way, blow up at some point. There's simply been too many examples of this behavior not to manifest in something substantial or a climax at some point. And that's not even all that I appreciated within this training portion. The idea that Togashi had for empowering the two boys was honestly brilliant. Having already, chapters prior, established what it took Kurapika to conjure chains like he did, we now understand what the equivalent would be for transmuters like Killua or enhancers like Gon. In other words, they couldn't possibly make up the difference overnight, and so they decided to lean into their past traumas from their family life. Killua spent years being shocked and tortured by his familial circumstances, and as a result, now can manifest lightning from his fingers like some sort of Sith Lord. I've mentioned before that a large part of his story comes from his determination to blaze his own trail and to do his own thing away from his family. However, it's that very past he's trying to move away from that's given him this ability. However, on a positive note, he seems to be utilizing that trauma to bolster his efforts independent of his family. As far as the auditions go, both of them qualify exceptionally easy, and once Gon enters the game, the visuals are immediately distinguishable from pretty much everything else I've seen in the series thus far, at least in the manga. The backgrounds are intricately detailed, however, thankfully not distractingly so. Despite the solid black colors in the background, the characters are always easy to make out at a glance, making these pages exceptionally easy to digest. And that's important because this is one of the first places where they give us the rules of the game. And surprisingly, the game sounds pretty engaging, you know, for a game that exists exclusively within a manga series for the purposes of a single arc from the early 2000s. Once he enters the game proper, the reveal of the game world in the manga is honestly stunningly beautiful also, with a full 2-page spread. I'm honestly so jealous I want to be there, but also not, because I'd probably almost definitely die. Actually, you know what? That reminds me. I asked a few people what sort of Nen power they thought I might have, and I figured I'd ask you guys the same. Of all the Nen types, which do you think I would be, given my personality or what you know about me? Leave a comment down below. I'd be really interested to see what you guys think. More on the Greed Island front, one thing that caught my attention before Gon entered the main area was the message he received from Jing and the subsequent conversation he had with Killua about it afterwards. Because only one person can enter the game at any given time, this offered Togashi something I would never have thought to do, and it's completely changed my impression of Gon as a character and what I think his goal really is. The impression Jing has given me is that he's a pretty messed up person and certainly not a good father, to put it mildly. The message he left on the cartridge that Gon was so eager to hear made me want to punch him in the face. He says, "Welcome, Gon. This is the game I made with my friends. Well, go ahead and enjoy. If you thought there'd be a clue to help you find me, too bad. I just wanted to show off our game. Anyway, now you're stuck here until you get the item that'll let you out, so play your heart out." I didn't think much of this message from him until I heard Gon's recanting of the message back to Killua when asked about it. Gon says, and I quote, "Yeah, Jing told me to enjoy the game." If that's all he thought was worth repeating from that message, then I think that speaks volumes for Gon's mindset here. Sometimes it's not what you say, but what you don't say. I think he sincerely wants to find a connection with his father now, and doesn't want to accept that his father isn't what he wants him to be. Instead, opting to accept that the problem lies with him, and maybe if he can improve and better himself, then maybe Jing will want to be his father. Whatever way this story decides to take this eventual interaction, I'm certain it will leave me in a flood of tears. After arriving at the first town, Gon and Killua are faced with the reality of their situation, and furthermore, the consequences of this reality becomes all the more clear. And interestingly, this acts as a great opportunity for the story to share with us some new characters and introduce us to the metagame or strategy some folks have decided to employ within this world. There are those looking to kill as many people as they can to free up the different cards they need to collect, and then there are those that want to gain a monopoly on the cards in circulation and get everyone out that way. Looking back at these factions and ideologies, it's clear that this game was designed to push people into conflict around these cards. Players are supposed to hoard as many cards as they can in whatever way they can, living up to its name, Greed Island. Somewhat appropriate that this game was created in part by the admittedly selfish Jing. Somewhat curiously, however, this whole scene with the recruiters to enlist Gon and Killua, I thought it would be a vehicle for a clearly defined goal moving towards the conclusion, you know? I thought they would join. Well, that didn't exactly happen.
俺はいい。自力でプレイするから。リーダーがそう言うんだね。
Gon outright refuses to participate and soon afterwards confirms my worry. He didn't join because he didn't want to hear people bad-mouthing his father's game. A game with mechanics that fosters this sort of behavior. It became clear to me at this point that Gon was in denial, with Killua even looking curiously at him through the side of his eyes saying, "People do die in this game, you know." And despite that, Gon just digs his heels in, saying things like, "The scariest thing isn't the game, it's the player's willingness to take cards by hurting others." And while that observation is, in a very technical sense, the case, I think this moment is possibly the most overtly obvious and transparent Gon has been about his father. And this is a running trend during this arc as a whole. There are numerous instances where players try their best to survive in this game, and yet the only thing Gon seems to get angry at is how some choose to not have fun with the game and instead focus on their own escape. He can't seem to empathize with the positions they seem to be in. And you know what? It's unsurprising considering what we've seen from this character throughout the story. This is the one aspect of this arc that I borderline hate. But just so we're clear, I can totally see someone liking this story more specifically because of all the things I'm about to criticize. And furthermore, I loved the material before this and I really loved the material afterwards. But yeah, this is what I find extremely unappealing about this arc so far. The game. I don't think I've ever seen something like Greed Island ever attempted before in an anime. Something like Sword Art Online comes to mind, but that sort of cops out by making the game work under real-world logic with limited amounts of exposition needed to actually understand or enjoy the game being played by the characters. It pretty much gamifies anime, something that us as an audience already understand, but with Greed Island, Togashi animeifies gaming. This is legitimately a game with mechanics, spells, and rules, and oh, so many breaking rules. On one hand, I'm legitimately impressed, like this could actually be a game, and I think once you learn how to play it actually could be fun. However, one thing I will say is that whenever I get asked if I'd like to play a board game with my friends, one of the main things holding me back from always saying yes is the necessary or required reading before you can play it. In other words, you need to understand the rules in order to play, and I think that's one of this arc's weakest areas. There are so many things we need to learn in this arc about this game. Before we go into the game, we're told how it works. When we enter the game, the menu girl tells us more about how it works. When we meet the group of recruiters, they lecture us more about how the game works and the metagame therein, and as their scenes continue later on down the line, there's even more information thrusted onto us as an audience. Heck, chapter 134 has literally 4 entire pages of just spells and their functions. There's no artwork here, and you know what, I wouldn't mind either if this was story, but it's not. It's just cards. It's just cards and what they do. I'm not reading and learning the inner workings of a game that I'm never going to play, and I think it's really cool and impressive that Togashi has actually gone out of his way to make this game, but it does come with that significant downside. With the game itself requiring us as readers to understand how it works, scenes that would normally be written to satisfy the showing and not telling function of a story are effectively put on the back burner in favor of long stretches of dialogue sequences as some guy talks about a particular spell or mechanic or whatever. Again, literally 4 pages of spells with no artwork. I can't stress enough how little reading these pages received from me. I did not read them because I did not want to. Part of me also thinks it's hilarious, by the way, so I don't hate it completely. But that's not to say that it's all talking either. Although there is a lot of explaining through dialogue in the opening of this arc, there are instances of showing and not telling too. Take for example the exchange in chapter 133 where Killua and Gon, after winning the Sword of Truth, get tailed by some creeps looking to steal their newly acquired card. The means with which Gon and Killua avoid this card being stolen was both fun and informative. For me, I prefer to learn by playing and not by reading. I mean, even I know that the opening tutorials of games are better suited when you play and understand the game rather than the game lecturing you about how it's supposed to be played. And the same applies in this arc. And look, I know I ragged earlier on Togashi's overall convoluted means of communicating the lore and rules of this game to us, but that's not to say that there isn't a tremendous and subtle play being made during this either. At every available opportunity, almost to a pathetic degree, Gon would go out of his way to express how much fun he's having. Whether that be to Killua as he anticipates what the combat might look like, or even after something as mundane as buying a map. He's quick to make up excuses for the dangerous or boring elements of the game, and in the same breath condemns those that would try their best to win and effectively save their own lives from it. And you know what? This aspect of the arc is easily its strongest quality for me. And that's when we get this exchange between members of the Phantom Troop after hopping into the game themselves.
このゲームは仮想世界ではなく現実世界のどこかで行われている
This was a brilliant swerve, and ironically one that conflicts with Gon's current fantasy land he's currently living in. If this is true, this shatters what Gon was saying about his father. But something tells me that even more mental gymnastics are on the horizon for our little Gon character. And without missing a step, with almost perfect comedic timing, this is definitely my favorite section thus far in the arc. There's plenty of Gon confronting some grim truths, but there's also this character called Biscuit. And as a character, I didn't expect her to be such a nice fit for the group, and on first viewing, I never would have anticipated her to impact the plot the way that she has. With all of the exposition over the last 20 or so chapters, I was relieved to see that we were finally getting some light or comedic interactions with a much smaller scope for a bit. In essence, the boys are now trying to make their way through this crowd of monsters, and while we're made aware that this little girl-looking person called Biscuit is following them, I enjoyed how, even before we as an audience were made aware of her identity and profession, that she still continued to tail them, continuing to comment on their progress or promise as Nen users. Apart from getting to see the two boys engage with all sorts of strange creatures throughout this area, seeing her finally drop the act and tell them who she really is was honestly quite interesting. Not just because it's nice to see who we're finally dealing with, but also to get a much more accurate understanding of how powerful some folks really are relative to the rest. And as luck would have it, she's actually a 57-year-old Nen master of sorts. She taught Wing everything he knows back in the day, and now she wants to help teach the boys? Okay, I'm game. Yeah, let's do this. Wait, they need to deal with him. Alright, so the current objective right now is to defeat this man she just defeated in moments within a 2-week time limit. None of them can leave the area. If the two boys fail, they get punished, and if he fails, then he gets killed by Biscuit. Now, this right from the outset was interesting to me for one prevailing reason. With a stipulation like that, it's tailor-made to deliver one specific conclusion. A conclusion that shows how much more adept in a combat sense Gon and Killua have become, as well as to give them a chance to shine from an emotional standpoint also. Gon has no malice for this guy, despite what she's told him about him. And throughout this fight, we get a sort of peek into his past living in the slums and struggling there. But despite knowing this, Gon won't finish him, even after he gives up. It's a great sequence, but to be honest, the end of it was my favorite, with Biscuit remarking that he's a flawless specimen and it makes him a delicate balance. Now that sounds surprisingly similar to how the appraiser described Gon earlier. That is not a coincidence. And that's when we get to the training portion of this story. The training portion of the story is easily its strongest section from a pure enjoyment standpoint for me. I love the Biscuit character, what she represents as a goal, and what sort of challenges or obstacles she places in front of Killua and Gon. Sleeping with a rock hoisted above their head, digging through a mountain, fighting different wild animals. All of these are such fun ideas and gave me much needed respite from the prior exposition heavy sections. And to be honest, sections like this can only exist when the exposition is gotten out of the way. Take any popular work. Whenever you're feeling like you're getting a lot of words or explanations thrown at you, oftentimes, at least if the story is halfway decent, it's an indication that there's something impressive coming up later. And normally this takes the form of a big page spread or a nice action sequence or something. But instead, Togashi, it seems, decided to stretch out that garnered time in the form of a training mini-arc. And while I didn't enjoy all of the clunky explanations earlier, I did very much enjoy this portion of the story centered around Gon's training. And curiously too, Biscuit remarks to herself that the game Greed Island, if played in the correct order, naturally makes the player stronger. And she, perhaps correctly, reckons that Jing made it like this, perhaps to train his son. This would answer my question that I posed in the first York New video, where I asked, if Jing is so gung-ho on never being found or meeting up with Gon, why did he leave all of that stuff behind in the first place? And the answer to that Biscuit seems to be satisfied with, is so that Gon can get stronger. The implications of which I'm not sure if I want to read into. Does Jing want to fight Gon? Right, so while all of that is happening, the subplot between the large group that wanted to combat the murderers of the game with a monopoly of cards resumes, and I'm oh so grateful for how this one ended. At the moment, there are currently 4 plot threads going on right now. The Phantom Troop uncovering the truth of the island, the Monopoly Gang, the killers of the game, and of course, Gon and Killua's training under Biscuit. And half of these I don't care at all about. Those being the killers of the game and the lads looking to organize a monopoly. Ideally, one would be at least a little interested in all of these stories to various degrees, but these just didn't do it for me, though Togashi does fix this eventually. How? Well, by having the killers infiltrate the Monopoly crowd, steal all of their cards, and I love how this scene was handled. It focuses on a small collection of 3 characters as they weasel their way into the position of power before ultimately betraying and deceiving everyone that trusted them. This gives us a clear point of conflict for Gon and Killua to run up against eventually, give us a goal as an audience, and it helped us understand and better get to know the individuals involved. Overall, I'm delighted with this creative decision. Things are far more simple now, and the story feels all the better for it, and this isn't even my favorite part of the story. Throughout this tale, a minor subplot concerning certain members of the Phantom Troop and the Greed Island video game has yielded brief but fascinating moments of intrigue for me, completely recontextualizing the entire occasion as not a game, but instead a teleporter to a real-life island closely monitored by some spooky and imposing individual that claims to be one of the creators of the game before yeeting everyone away that didn't enter in the correct fashion. And furthermore, he probably knows about Jing, so let's friggin' go! Maybe this Greed Island game wasn't a complete waste of time for Gon after all. I wonder if this guy will actually end up coming into contact with Gon at some point. I hope he does. One of the most important aspects of a training arc is to visibly see in no uncertain terms the progression made by the trained individual. It's basic and we see it in pretty much every training arc's conclusion. We saw it after the time skip in Dragon Ball when Goku arrives at the tournament all grown up and hella strong. We saw it in Eren Yeager's fantastic 3D maneuvering in episode 4, and we saw it numerous times throughout My Hero Academia. Point is, we gotta see as an audience that oh so delicious contrast from what once was to what is now. And boy, do we see that in Greed Island. Lingering in the back of my mind all this time was, just when exactly is Togashi going to have Killua get his hunter's license? Partially, I was thinking about this because, yeah, surely he doesn't want us to sit through yet another copy of the exact same story again, and while we did retread some familiar and, admittedly nostalgic territory, Killua made sure that his was a brief affair, with the very first phase proving to be little challenge to the young boy, eliminating literally everyone who participated at once and achieving his license there and then. And upon his return, Killua says the hilarious line, "It took me longer to get here than it did to get the license." And that's not even the craziest part of this entire section. When Killua arrives back and regains his bearings with the group, check out what happens when Killua looks at their recent encounters list.
Kuroro!
Okay, so now this story has gone from good to the most interesting I've encountered so far. While this story did have a rather rough start, boasting some of the most arduous and clunky narrative portions from the series, I genuinely think this story, particularly in its latter stuff, makes full use of characters that were established in the prior material and has massive stakes both in terms of the lives at risk and in terms of personal investment. We've gone from a game that was once made by some guy to a game that will kill you, and then to a game that will kill you but isn't really a game but instead a teleporter to a particular island in the real world. This is like Lost or something. This is a really crazy revelation and it's brilliant. And now we learn Hisoka's here as Chrollo's proxy. This is insane. And can I just say, my favorite drawing in this portion so far has to be this drawing of Chrollo from chapter 149. Togashi seems to really love how this character looks, and how pretty he is seems really important to him because he receives, as a character, the best treatment in the manga visually, far above everyone else. Now, I haven't gone back over the manga a tremendous amount to make this claim, but it seems to me when I'm reading it that Chrollo is drawn with like different materials, or if one character takes 5 minutes to draw, it's like Togashi spends about 15 minutes to half an hour drawing Chrollo. He's always like super rendered or super well drawn and never drawn poorly, or at least not that I've seen. Anyways, it's cool to see Chrollo back so soon and in such a creative way. I'm delighted to see what's to come from this, and additionally, I'd like to know how he got a console with a game in the first place. This is only the first half of this arc naturally, and I loved what this arc has become and the direction it's going. Next week, I'll be reading the rest of what this arc has to offer, and I really hope it can stick the landing to what I think it's gearing up for. Fingers crossed it can, but regardless, I can't wait to share my thoughts on it with you all next week. I've been Totally Not Mark. Thank you so much for watching.
What?